I thought today would be an opportune time, given that we have such distinguished representation for parliamentarians around the world. When we have a conversation about abusive practices in economic expansion, it's impossible to have that conversation without talking about Russia, without talking about what's going on in Ukraine. So I'm going to dedicate my remarks to talking about this within the context of economic expansion. Before I begin, let me make one show of solidarity. For those that were at the forum in December in Washington at the National Archives, we have a friend. We all remember her, parliamentarian Mariana Besulia, I'm sorry if I say her name wrong, who warned us about this at the forum. In fact, if you were at the forum, you'll remember she spoke up repeatedly throughout the day and said that she's a parliamentarian from Ukraine, saying that we are going to get invaded, we are going to be attacked, and the democracies need to wake up. When Vladimir Putin began his bombing campaign in Ukraine, I immediately thought of Mariana and her warning that she gave us essentially at the forum. And then it kind of reflected on me the importance of these gatherings, the importance of getting all of our friends together and having important conversations on these specific issues. Russia's invasion of Ukraine will have a global impact, even here in Guatemala. I just learned that Guatemala is a net importer of both wheat and fertilizers from Russia and Ukraine. So war, as it tends to do, brings shortages, and with shortages comes the hike of prices and inflation. So as the prices of wheat and fertilizer go up, you will see the price of food here in Guatemala go up as well. But this is just part of the economic effects of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. I think one of the angles that we are missing in understanding that conflict, that war that's going on right now, is the calculation that Vladimir Putin is making on the economic dimension. In the weeks, if not months, leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, the military buildup on the borders of Ukraine, there was a debate that was launched mostly within the European Union, but within the Western world, about what would be the adequate response should Russia do what it just did. And I think Vladimir Putin made that calculation because he kind of sparked that debate by doing the buildup. And the calculation that he made was that there was going to be no military response from NATO, from the United States, or from anyone in the international community. But I believe he anticipated that there was going to be a reaction, but that reaction was going to be what it was, which was swift and strong sanctions. But these sanctions did not surprise Vladimir Putin. In fact, he knew that they were coming. Even the de-swifting of the Russian banking system is something that Russia discussed going back to 2014 when they annexed Crimea. So back in 2014, I was in Bolivia, in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. I was at a conference by the United Nations called the Group of 77, the G77. You guys probably all are familiar with what I'm talking about. In fact, it was the 50th anniversary of the G77. And Russia was invited to the G77. This is back in June of 2014 by the then president of Bolivia, Mr. Evo Morales. And in the final declaration of this conference that was had in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, of the G77, there was a very specific point that the Russians proposed into the declaration. It's point 131, for those that want to look it up. And I'm going to quote what this point was in the declaration. We, meaning the group of 77 nations, we affirm the need to reform the international financial architecture so that we have a financial and monetary system that reflects the reality of the 21st century. The reformation, the reform of the international financial architecture has been a goal of Vladimir Putin for many, many years. One of the reasons he has this goal, one of the reasons he's been able to formulate this goal into specific policies and actions is because some of his advisors. I'm going to point specifically to Mr. Sergei Glaziev, who some of you may be familiar with because he was an economic advisor to Vladimir Putin up until 2019. In fact, if you read or you watch Vladimir Putin's remarks in the days leading up to his invasion of Ukraine, you would think he took excerpts from Sergei Glassev's book published in 1999 called A Genocide, Russia and the New World Order. Taking an excerpt of an interview that Mr. Glassev gave in 2014 during the annexation of Crimea, these are the words of Mr. Sergei Glassev, Vladimir Putin's former economic advisor for Eurasian economic integration. In an interview in 2014, he says, "The entire crisis in Ukraine was provoked by American institutions with their European partners, and they financed neo-Nazis." These were the words of Sergei Glassev back then, and these are the words of Vladimir Putin today. Because in their worldview, in Sergei Glassev and Vladimir Putin's worldview, the most serious way to attack the United States and the West, and this includes Europe and Latin America, is to collapse the US dollar. And the best way to do that, the way they want to approach that, is to build an anti-dollar alliance. In my humble opinion, this is what the invasion of Ukraine is all about. It's not just an attack on the sovereign territory of Ukraine. It's an attack on the international financial system that is intimately tied to the international order after World War II. So how are they going to do this? Well, over the years, not just Russia, but also Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, China, have figured out an antidote, a vaccine, if you will, to US and international sanctions, which is disinformation. Disinformation has become the #1 weapon used in 21st century warfare. And since 2014, specifically, because Russia was sanctioned because of its annexation of Crimea, since then, Vladimir Putin has more than tripled the budget of the communications apparatus of the Kremlin. This includes both Spanish and Portuguese state media or state-owned or controlled media outlets. In just 4 years, they went from 7 million followers on RT Español to more than 25 followers today. This is a serious megaphone in Spanish that Vladimir Putin has. And what are they saying? Well, they have a narrative. If you watch or if you listen to any of these interviews on RT English, Español, or whatever language you prefer, and the narrative is one of joint victimization. They say that Russia and its allies are calling sanctions a crime against humanity. That's right, the regime that is actively bombing urban centers in Ukraine and killing civilians is saying that he's the victim, but we are the war criminals. But this is a serious discourse. This is a serious effort taken apart by Russia, and they have a term for this. They're trying to replace the term of sanctions in the United Nations with unilateral coercive measures. Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine because he wanted the sanctions. He wanted the sanctions because he wanted the opportunity to accuse the West and the current financial system, the international financial system, to say that it's a weapon of warfare rather than a mechanism for commerce and international trade as it is. And eventually, what Vladimir Putin is looking for is for countries around the world to drop the US dollar as a reserve currency, and his partner in this effort is Xi Jinping and China. This is why days before the Ukraine invasion, China made Russia its #1 supplier of oil. This also came with a 1-year deal to buy 100 million tons of coal from Russia denominated in non-dollar transactions. Yesterday, or maybe 2 days ago, American Express, Visa, and MasterCard all banned their operations or prohibited their operations in Russia. The immediate response? Russia's state-owned Sberbank went to replace Visa and MasterCard with China's UnionPay system. And China is now promoting with more intensity their cross-border interbank payment system, CEPS, that was launched in 2015 after the annexation of Crimea. What am I saying? I'm saying they prepared for this moment. They knew what was going to happen. They provoked these actions, and they're ready with the response. But this goes essentially at the heart of what we're having the discussions all over today. Whether we're talking about illicit trade or we're talking about abusive practices, corruption, at the heart of what we're talking about is illicit activity versus legitimate activity. Those of us in this room, we are all part of a formal, democratic, liberal market order. We prefer to engage in that method because it's beneficial for me and it's beneficial for you. However, certain countries, certain actors prefer the illicit way of transacting because they say it's easier. But I raise the question of what makes illicit trade illicit. At the end of the day, what makes an illicit activity illicit? I'll give you the answer. It's a border. And that's no clearer anywhere else in the world than on the border of Colombia, Venezuela. Because the border, more than a physical line on the map, is oftentimes different visions, different legal systems, and in some cases, it's a difference between freedom and persecution. That's why Vladimir Putin wants to redraw the map. That's why Xi Jinping wants to take over Taiwan. And that's why Nicolas Maduro has his eyes on Colombia. Because they want to change the international order by changing the definition of what is illicit and making us the illicit actors and them the legitimate actors. So Russia's expansion into Ukraine is part of a global economic expansion of illicit trade with criminalized states. And if you think this is far away from here in Guatemala, if you think this is far away from Guatemala, just look at Venezuela. Venezuela is the first part of this conflict here in the Western Hemisphere, and it's how Vladimir Putin has been able to diminish the geographic disadvantage that he have had over time, even throughout the Cold War. But we've been here before. You know, history doesn't repeat itself, but it tends to rhyme. And we've seen unnatural alliances. We've seen countries come together that perhaps don't have a lot in common in terms of culture or history. So for all the differences that Russia, China, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela have, they have a common objective. They have a common enemy, and that's to change the international order. But as I mentioned, we saw this more than 100 years ago when certain countries wanted to maintain their way of governance. And they came together even though they didn't have shared history or culture. I'm referring to the Empire of Japan, the Empire of Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. And had they succeeded, the 20th century may not have seen democracy go to its highest points ever in its history. But people like you, forums like this, ensured that that didn't happen. We're facing that moment once again. It's not just Vladimir Putin. Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela have decided to work together with the sole purpose of changing the definitions of what we know as reality. And the only way that they're going to be stopped is if we decide to stop them. Thank you very much.
Foro Parlamentario de Inteligencia y Seguridad, Ciudad de Guatemala. Un evento organizado por el Congreso de la República de Guatemala, el Gobierno de la República de Guatemala y Caribbean Bermuda and Latin America Crime Stoppers.